Plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually. When a plant reproduces asexually, it clones itself. It creates another plant with an identical genotype. In asexual reproduction, new individuals are produced from a single parent without the fusion of sex cells. While plants may still reproduce sexually, asexual reproduction is advantageous whenever conditions are stable and the plant is thriving in its current environment. When environmental conditions vary or change suddenly, genetic diversity becomes important. Those organisms adapted to the environmental changes will have a better chance of surviving. Genetic diversity is generated through sexual reproduction, a process that involves the fusion of two reproductive cells, or gametes, such as an egg and a sperm. In sexual reproduction, genetic diversity is achieved through recombination and independent assortment of gamete chromosomes. Both sexual and asexual reproduction are important in agriculture. For example, most fruit trees are grown from grafts. A graft is a shoot or bud, called the scion, that has been joined to another plant called the stalk. Grafting allows for optimal combinations of root systems, good-tasting fruit, and resistance to pests. Grafting is a form of asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction and selection are at the heart of plant breeding. Many characteristics, such as resistance to disease and pests, have been introduced into crop plants over hundreds of years. One example is resistance to leaf rust, a damaging disease caused by a fungal pathogen. Wheat breeding programs have developed varieties of wheat that are resistant to the rust fungus. Resistant varieties typically possess a leaf rust resistance gene called an LR gene. Biotechnology provides another route to introducing desired genes and traits into plants. It can accomplish things that traditional breeding techniques cannot. For example, resistance to leaf rust that is introduced through traditional crossbreeding is often associated with a single gene product. Resistance to this gene product may be overcome by a resistant strain of rust fungus that evolves through natural selection. After a few years, the once resistant varieties of wheat lose their effectiveness against the disease. This process is similar to the way bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. To get around these problems, scientists are in the process of bioengineering a more durable variety of wheat that has multiple gene resistance. This is like using a multiple drug cocktail in the treatment of HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The wheat's fungus-resistant gene products work together like HIV drugs. Even if the fungus becomes resistant to one of the gene products, the other gene products still prevent the fungus from growing on the wheat. In this activity, we'll learn how plants reproduce and develop. We'll start by examining the different types of asexual reproduction. We'll then learn about sexual reproduction and embryonic development in plants. Asexual reproduction is reproduction by mitosis. It results in the creation of a new individual genetically identical to the parent. It does not involve sex cells, which are produced through meiosis. Plants reproduce asexually in many different ways. They may reproduce vegetatively, producing clones of themselves, or through the formation of spores. The vegetative organs of a plant are its roots, stems, and leaves. One example of vegetative reproduction involving a plant's stem is seen in strawberries. Strawberry plants produce horizontal stems above the ground from which roots and new plants can grow. Such stems or runners are called stolons. Rhizomes are horizontal stems that run underground. Irises use rhizomes to propagate. Bulbs like garlic, tubers like potatoes, and corms like gladioli are also stems that are involved in vegetative reproduction. Plants of the genus Bryophyllum reproduce through their leaves. Mitosis along the leaf margins produces tiny plantlets that fall off and become new plants. This is an example of reproduction by fragmentation. In fragmentation, a piece of the parent plant breaks off and develops into a new individual. Some plants use their roots for asexual reproduction. Trees, such as poplars or aspens, and dandelions are common examples. Anyone who has ever tried to remove dandelions from a lawn knows firsthand about their extensive root system. Plants may also asexually reproduce by forming spores. A spore is a reproductive cell that produces a new organism without fertilization, that is, without the fusing of two sex cells. Spores are most conspicuous in flowerless plants such as liverworts, mosses, and ferns. Seeds may be produced asexually as well as sexually. In apomixis, seeds are asexually produced from a diploid female sex cell. Apomixis is important in the propagation of hybrid plants. It preserves the vigor of the hybrid plants without the variability introduced by sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is only part of a plant's life cycle. The complete reproductive life cycle of a plant alternates between the diploid sporophyte phase and the haploid gametophyte phase. Diploid cells contain 2 copies of each chromosome, whereas haploid cells contain only 1 copy of each chromosome. In vascular plants, the diploid sporophyte phase is the prevailing phase. In other plants, such as mosses, the haploid gametophyte phase is the major phase. The fact that plants have a multicellular haploid phase after meiosis and before the production of gametes makes their life cycle different from the life cycle of animals. Sexual reproduction varies among plant groups. In flowering plants, the angiosperms, the diploid sporophyte produces haploid spores by meiosis. Meiosis marks the transition from the diploid sporophyte generation to the haploid gametophyte generation. The haploid spores divide by mitosis to form male and female gametophytes that then produce the egg and sperm cells. Fertilization occurs when an egg and a sperm cell fuse to form a diploid zygote. Fertilization returns the haploid gametophyte generation to the diploid sporophyte generation. The zygote develops into a multicellular seed that contains a diploid sporophyte embryo. The seed is enclosed within an ovary, which matures into a fruit. The seed germinates and a new sporophyte plant develops. The sporophyte plant matures, forms flowers, and the process repeats. The flower is the reproductive structure of angiosperms. The male reproductive organ is the stamen. Each stamen is made up of the anther and the filament. The anther contains the cells that develop into the male gametophytes, or pollen. Pollen is formed when cells within the anther undergo meiosis to form haploid microspores. Each microspore divides by mitosis to form two cell types, a generative cell and a tube cell. A wall forms around these two cells, completing the pollen grain. Sperm cells form from the generative cell. The female reproductive organ is the carpel. Some flowers have a single carpel. Others have many fused together called the pistil. The carpel is made up of the stigma, which is joined to the ovary by the style. The sticky stigma receives pollen for fertilization. The ovary produces the female reproductive cells, the eggs. The ovary contains one or more ovules in which the female gametophytes develop. Cells within the ovule undergo meiosis to form 4 haploid megaspores, only one of which typically survives. The surviving megaspore undergoes 3 rounds of mitosis followed by cell division to form a multicellular embryo sac with 8 nuclei, the female gametophyte. 6 cells in the embryo sac have a single nucleus and 1 cell has 2 nuclei. At one end, there are 3 antipodal cells, and at the other end are 3 cells, 2 called synergids, and the egg. The cell with 2 nuclei is called the mother cell. After fertilization, the ovary develops into a fruit, and the ovules develop into seeds. The seeds contain the new plant embryos. Pollen is released from the plant and finds its way to the stigma. Insects, birds, and the wind facilitate this process called pollination. Plants have evolved colorful petals and scents to attract the animals that pollinate them, and sugary nectar to reward them. Animals have evolved specialized structures that allow them to extract the precious nectar from flowers. The pollination of plants by animals is an example of coevolution. When the male and female reproductive structures are found on the same plant, the plant species is said to be monoecious. Examples of monoecious species are corn plants, apple trees, and rose bushes. When the male and female reproductive structures are found on different plants, the species is said to be dioecious. Examples of dioecious plants include date palms, persimmon trees, and holly plants. If you have a date palm in your backyard, would you expect it to produce lots of dates? Select your answer by clicking in the box. No, that's incorrect. The correct answer is it depends. Because the date palm is dioecious, the male and female structures are found on separate trees. Production of dates depends on the palm being female because it's the female's ovary that develops into fruit. However, a male tree must be nearby to provide pollen for fertilization, the event that leads to the development of fruit. The evolution of separate male and female plants is an example of an adaptation that prevents self-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to a stigma on the same plant. Plants have evolved many different strategies to prevent self-pollination to preserve the genetic diversity associated with sexual reproduction. When a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a compatible plant, it germinates and forms a tubular structure that leads to the ovule. The generative cell divides, forming 2 sperm nuclei. A double fertilization then takes place. One sperm nucleus fuses with an egg nucleus to form a diploid zygote. The other sperm nucleus fuses with the nuclei of the mother cell to form the endosperm, a nutritive tissue. Now that we've seen how fertilization occurs, let's see how the zygote develops into a new plant. The zygote or fertilized egg eventually develops into a seed that gives rise to a new plant. The first step in this process is the formation of the plant embryo. The zygote undergoes mitosis to form a basal cell and a terminal cell. The terminal cell divides to form the embryo. The basal cell divides to form the suspensor. The suspensor pushes the embryo into the endosperm and transfers nutrients and hormones that the embryo will need to grow. As the embryo develops, seed leaves form. Embryos contain 1 or 2 seed leaves called cotyledons. Plants are classified as monocots when they have 1 seed leaf and as dicots when they have 2. The ovule loses water and matures into a seed when a protective seed coat forms. While the ovule is maturing into a seed, the flower's ovary develops into the rest of the fruit. Simple fruits form from a single ovary. They may be dry, such as in chestnuts and corn, or fleshy, as in oranges and apples. Aggregate fruits form from multiple ovaries of a single flower. Raspberries and blackberries are examples of aggregate fruits. Multiple fruits develop from the ovaries of different flowers that fuse together. Pineapples and figs are multiple fruits. Some other parts of a flower also contribute to what we call fruit in the grocery store. For example, the flesh of an apple we bite into results from the enlarged base or receptacle of the flower. The ovary develops into the apple core. The seeds are inside the core. Their tough brown coat is the ovule wall. Opposite the apple stem, the sepals are visible at the base of the apple, sometimes with the stamens still attached. Why do plants go through all the trouble of producing fruit when all that's needed to start a new plant is the seed? Birds, animals, and other creatures eat the plant's fruit. This facilitates wide dispersal of the plant's seeds. This is important since plants don't move around. Seed dispersal ensures that the new plants don't compete with the parent plant for sunlight, water, and minerals. When environmental conditions such as moisture, temperature, and sunlight are right, a seed will germinate or grow. The root of the embryo emerges first. In monocots such as wheat, rice, and corn, the shoot, or leafy portion of the embryo, then breaks through the soil's surface. The seed's food reserves stay underground. In dicots, such as beans, peas, potatoes, and sunflowers, the root forms a hook that pushes through the surface. Then, in response to sunlight, the hook straightens and the shoot emerges. The food reserves are either brought above the surface of the soil, as in a bean, or remain below ground, as in a pea. Once a portion of the plant is above ground, it uses sunlight rather than its food reserves to meet its energy needs for development and growth. plants may reproduce asexually or sexually. In asexual reproduction, an entirely new plant arises that is genetically identical to the parent plant. In sexual reproduction, egg and sperm cells combine to form a new plant that is genetically distinct from the parent plants. In asexual reproduction, different parts of the plant, stems, roots, leaves, and spores can give rise to new plants. In sexual reproduction, specialized structures have evolved to produce the reproductive cells. In angiosperms, the flowers contain the reproductive organs. The male reproductive organ is the stamen, and the female reproductive organ is the carpel. These organs may be found fully developed in the same flower, in different flowers on the same plant, or on different plants. The development of distinct male and female plants is one of the mechanisms that prevents self-pollination, ensuring genetic diversity. Animals play an important role in the pollination of plants. The synergy between plants and animals in the pollination process is one of the best examples of coevolution. Fertilization occurs after pollination. The sperm and egg fuse to form a zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo, which is the beginning of the new plant. The embryo is part of a seed, and the seed is encased in a fruit. The fruit aids in the seed dispersal, and under the right conditions the seed germinates and a new plant develops. Plants have developed wonderfully diverse reproductive strategies. While we have focused on the reproductive details of flowering plants, the themes of adaptation and survival can be seen in all species of plants.